is that once you're invited, you are actually fully in. So you participate in everything. It's not like a second class. The only thing you notice is that you speak after the permanent members. That's fine. Apart from that, you are invited to all the work. We have been so far to 19 ministerial meetings, which is quite a bit in the course of a year, and there are 5 to go, I think. Yeah, 4 to go, including the summit in a couple of weeks. And of course, many more meetings if you take all the working groups and all the things. The Sherpa, Henrik Harbo, has he's been an active, frequent flyer to Brazil this year, and a lot of people have been engaged. And these have been really serious, credible, important engagements in many of the key topics of our time, as I think everybody here know. Once upon a time, there was a fear that the G20 would replace the formal global institutions. I think that is less of a challenge now. I think rather on the contrary, that the G20 provides a more informal arena. Believe it or not, it has an informal nature to it, where you can discuss more in a frank and open manner between the countries that really matter, and then take some of that to the formal forest. For instance, one of the successes of the UN, there are not that many right now, but one of the successes is the adoption of the Pact for the Future during the General Assembly. And that was a very interesting, it was a very comprehensive project. I have to say that although I'm one of the most UN-friendly people in Norway and ministers around, I was not convinced that it would get much traction. It actually did. And my sense is the conversations that were held in the G20 helped, because there was a clear understanding, and even also in one of the earliest meetings that when I attended the first foreign ministers meeting, it was very much with reference to what would then happen in the formal forest in the UN. And when in September, there was a last-ditch effort by Russia to undermine the whole effort and try to block the adoption of the Pact for the Future. They got a very heavy reprimand led by the Africa group. So Africa jointly took the responsibility and saying, we actually got so much into this that we don't want to lose it now. And you had a very small club of usual suspects who voted with Russia, and a colossal amount of countries voting or then adopting the Pact for the Future. So that link is actually very good. And I think to the extent there is any progress on reform of the multilateral financial institutions, I think that also has been accelerated by conversations in the G20. So the G20 delivers even in difficult times. But times are difficult. And what we are seeing now, of course, is that many of the key principles and values that we've seen as allegedly universal, maybe also, some people would say liberal values in the broad sense, as the liberal international order, is under strain. And that has to do both with the emergence of powers that have a different priority, which is the classical explanation, but also by the external has not lived up to its standards by not being consistent in the application of international law. And you mentioned the double standards. Double standards is a real problem. It's substantial. It's not just an argument. It actually happens. The very firm and correct and absolutely substantially legally the legally correct position on Ukraine, that Russia invaded, Ukraine is the victim, this breaks the rule number 1 of the UN Charter, was not followed up with a similar response to the excessive Israeli response to the 7 October attacks, where everybody agrees that Israel, as any country, should defend itself against terror, but the way they did it violated both international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and international human rights law. And the perception of double standards from the core countries that traditionally were standing up for these values have, served on the silver platter an argument to those who want to criticize these values anyway. So this has really been a challenge. It's not only from the outside of my part of the world, it's also from the inside. And that has been emerging theme of this year, or rather the last full year, I would say, and coinciding with Brazil's chairmanship. So when I pay tribute to Brazil, it's because it's probably one of the most difficult years in modern history to chair the G20, but it's also been one of the most important years of modern history to chair the G20 because we really needed that forum, and it's been successful. After the summit, then when we come to 1st December, South Africa will take over. They will carry on some of the themes from Brazil. The strong focus on poverty and hunger, for instance, which was key to the Brazilian agenda, will continue. Global governance reform will continue. The strengthening of Africa in G20, because you have African states, there is every reason to expect there will be African invitees, but also that from this year on, the African Union is a permanent member. Means there's a very high degree of continuity, and to put it that way, we stand more than ready to participate also with South Africa if they so desire, and my expectation is that they might. That's as far as I can go here, but we have found this as a very useful experience. There's I think everybody here knows that South Africa takes over. Maybe not everybody knows who is the next president, but that's quite interesting because that's the United States of America. And it means that the 2026 presidency will be Donald Trump's. And actually, because of the troika structure, it means that the incumbent, the previous, and the next are together in the troika format, which means the United States of America will join the troika on the 1st of December. That's like a couple of weeks from now, under Biden, but clearly preparing for a presidency that would be Trump's. That's quite interesting because we don't know all the contours of Donald Trump presidency of the US yet, but if we should judge from the two most logical sources, which is what happened the last time and what does he say and what does his people say, that's kind of the best we have. He is not, to be diplomatic, he's not thrilled by multilateral diplomacy. He is quite transactional. And he wants to be transactional, he wants to be unpredictable. But maybe the format of G20, which is that leaders meet leaders without much other fanfare, could be an attractive arena for that kind of policy. So maybe it would be smart now to engage early with the incoming US president of the US, also in preparing for the presidency or the chairship of G20, which might be interesting. Another expectation I have is that his team will want to take more of the focus back to the original core issue of economy, of international finance and economy, and maybe less on promoting democracy and LGBT rights and so on. The broader agenda might be somewhat narrower again under US presidency, but of course that's just the chair. The other countries will continue to matter on how the agenda is set. One theme which was when we were in Rio de Janeiro in January, we spoke about the then upcoming ministerial meeting in the WTO, which happened only days after. I basically I took a little stopover in Oslo and went on to Abu Dhabi for the WTO. And I had the mixed blessing, I would say, of being tasked with negotiating how to fix the problem of the appellate body. I would say, which was only partly successful, very kind to myself. Although there was an agreement to try to fix it by the end of this year. And what we saw there was that the number one critic or the least forthcoming member was the United States under Biden. And the undermining of the appellate body, which is the one piece of the WTO which is supranational, which has an element of supranationality, because you can appeal, and then in the first instance you try to solve a trade dispute amicably, that function is still there, but if that doesn't work, you go to an appellate body. And what happened under Trump's first presidency was that the US simply stopped accepting new members, which are not called judges, because it's very important that these are members of the appellate body. They would in any other organization be judges. But eventually it was empty, which means that the body is actually not there, and then you appeal into the void. This means that the WTO only works to the extent that members want to make it happen. There's no sanction, there's no reaction if you don't. But that was continued during Biden, and I see very limited scope for this to be fixed with Trump coming back. Because there are two things that the Americans seem to agree upon, which is China and and to fight free trade, basically, which is quite interesting because we have grown up in a world where the US took a hegemonic role, first in the West after 1945. In the US we have this constant tug of war between isolationists and internationalists, and 20th century is about the US that normally tries to stay out of other people's conflicts, particularly European conflicts, as long as they can. And then after a year or two of conflict, they realize that they can't stay out and they come anyway. And then they go, and then after the First World War, went back to a more isolationist position. That did not happen after the Second World War, and the US was extremely important to when the UN was formed. We would not have the UN we had without first FDR, until he died, and then Truman, and actually also Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, who was important. We would not have had, well, here in this part of the world, we would not have NATO. We would not have had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we would not have had GATT, which then later became the WTO. So in all these years, and what happened when the Cold War ended was that the US for a while aimed at being a more global hegemon, because the Cold War was over, and what used to be Western institutions became more universal institutions like the WTO. I mean, it's reasonable to predict, given what President Trump and his people say, that there is no aspirations of a hegemonic role. The US wants to be a great power with a transactional approach to the world. We can be proven otherwise, but this is, at least we have to prepare for such a scenario, and we may have trade wars. This situation, I mean, just makes the G20 more important, because you will easily see a picture where the formal institutions will be blocked even more than today. Because in formal institutions, blocking is possible because there are ways, to stop decision from being made, vetoes and lack of consensus and whatever is the decision-making process. Then you would need forums where you actually meet to discuss without, in that meeting, blocking anything, because there's nothing to block. I mean, you can block the final statement, but okay, the world can survive without the final statement. What's important is what's actually happening in the meetings. So that's going to be a very interesting setting. Back to what has happened and what is happening in the current world as we know it. I talked about the link to the Pact for the Future. The UN is becoming 80 next year. At 80 it's a responsible age, to put it that way. It's time to rethink some of the foundations, and I think that in order to make the formal international system survive the 21st century, it's time for major reforms. I'm not expecting the major reforms to happen next year, but it's really time to put them seriously on the agenda, and the Pact for the Future has allowed that, because it actually discussed this topic that I remember we discussed at NUPI when I was younger, 30 years ago. So, the composition of the Security Council is not like a question of yesterday. It's been on for many years, and the same conversation, who would be the natural new members? How can you both increase legitimacy through representation, but at the same time not lose efficiency? Because, of course, one worry is that an expanded Security Council with more members that also become veto powers because they want to be equals will simply be more vetoes, because more countries with vetoes will have more reason to veto. Can you connect that to a kind of weakening of the veto ideally take it away, but since the veto powers can veto taking away the veto, that's unlikely, but there might be other models to work around it. And these topics, plus all the topics about representation, I think in your report you talked about both input and output legitimacy, which I think is important to, and I'd like to say one word on that. We in the West, or we who have been kind of, I'm not saying Norway, but my type of countries who have been quite dominant in many institutions, might have thought that if the output is good for everybody, it doesn't really matter what the input is. If the delivery is good, you get good development aid, good processes to reduce poverty and enhance inclusion. It doesn't really matter what the input side is. Well, for many countries it does matter, and that to actually be present when decisions are made matters maybe more than we might have thought. We have that conversation in one of the things that is highest on my agenda, which is a universal tax reform, universal tax convention. That's my last word because I've spent my time. We believe, we like the Africa Group and like many in the Global South, we think we need a global tax convention anchored in the UN. And then the reality is that the OECD is doing really good work on tax. Advanced, high knowledge. There's much more competence in the OECD Secretariat and the UN Secretariat on these issues. The problem is that the organization is self-representative. So Norway is trying to take a role as a bridge builder between the good work of the OECD, but also the desire of the many to get a UN convention. That's a very good example about the difference between input and output legitimacy, which is discussed in these reports. So in other words, to sum up, this has been a good look with enthusiasm forward to the Trump presidency of the G20 and see how that will spell out and what that means both to global and American politics on these issues. And I think we as a guest country are happy to testify that the G20 is really a worthwhile place to be, which is why we would very much like to continue to be a guest country. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. We'll now proceed with the Q&A. I'll invite Hans Jørgen and Christiana to the stage, and Cedric de Koning. And we'll start with a very few questions on the studies that you have done, and then we'll invite also the Minister to the stage in a minute or so. I just have to make clear that the Minister has to leave at 10:30, so we will end this sharp at 10:30. So perhaps you could give us a little view of how South Africa, China, and Brazil see the G20. What's their perspective on the organization or the venue?
Well, let me start from this side. As the Minister mentioned, South Africa will host the G20 next year, so I think they've worked quite a bit on articulating their position and their priorities. As the Minister mentioned, it's quite clear that they will continue to prioritize some of the issues that Brasilia champion in terms of poverty and hunger. But I anticipate that their main focus will be on reforming the international debt architecture, tax reform, and illegal financial flows, which are, of course, linked to tax as well.
Great.
Seen from China, G20 is obviously a critically important forum, and China has been very enthusiastic about also evolving the G20 potentially also to something more effective than it is today. Complicated in the last few years with issues around treatment of Russia and sanctions and Ukraine, which has soured some of the mood, but still, a vital actor. And China is happy to be, of course, regarded as a developing and, to some extent, also an emerging power, but is, of course, fundamentally different in also the formal power it has in the Security Council and the economic clout and diplomatic resources it has compared to other countries. And you see that also playing out within the G20. I think one thing I want to mention parallel to the minister and your start today is, although the UN and other formal kind of bodies are diminishing their effectiveness in terms of reaching agreement, they are still incredibly vital and critically important for everything that has to do with data, information, basic assessments, which of course the G20 itself has, no capacity to develop. And in that extent, also you can see China being very active in also building up its positions in all the kind of supporting bodies around. Of course, if there's one issue that China will keep pushing for, especially now and not least moving forward, is free trade, free trade, free trade.
Great, thanks. Christiana?
Okay, I would say that for Brazil, Brazil sees the G20 as an opportunity to set the agenda for this important tool in global governance. So it's not just a chance of seat on the table, to have a seat on the table, but also to set the agenda and to set the priorities. So this year has been really important for Brazil that can shape this agenda to other forums, because the G20 is also an orchestrator to other organizations. So the G20 can call other organizations and can determine or at least shape the agenda for these other and calling these other organizations, specifically the financial ones, to implement their decisions and implement these decisions that are being made in this forum. So Brazil has a long tradition of multilateralism, and then for most of its history has sought this secure, privileged, in a way, position in multilateral organizations as a representative of the Global South and as a representative of Latin America. And especially during the Workers' Party terms, Lula and Dilma, this has been quite important as a main strategy, and this has been returned now with this Lula term. So I would say that G20 is quite important for Brazil now, and in the way that Brazil sees itself and try to position itself as a representative of the Global South. Yes.
Thanks. Minister, could I invite you to the stage? Thank you. Thanks. So, a few things pop up. You said in your talk, which was really interesting, that the G20 is a useful supplement in a way to the formal and existing system, where it's informal. You can come to agreement and then implement in a way through the multilateral organizations. And I think Hans-Jørgen touched on some of the same. When simply the G20 doesn't have a secretariat, like a permanent secretariat, or an organization, a bureaucracy that can follow up on decisions.
Which is good.
Which is good. Because for Norway, we are, it's in our strategic interest as a small country in a large world that the multilateral system continues to exist and that we have a role to play in it. However, so this complementarity from a benevolent kind of point of view seems good. But Norway is not a member of the G20, and we are dependent on the G20 to be invited. So how can we influence the agenda of the G20 when we're not a member, those years that we're not participating?
Well, I mean, clearly we can influence more if we're in than if we're out. So that's rather obvious. And I'm not expecting that we will be permanently invited. Although, of course, we are not a G20 economy. We are probably 25 or 26 on the list. So we're not so far away. So maybe if we join forces with the other Nordics, the Nordics together would be more than G10, on the lower end of G10. In size of economy, if that's the question. But of course, today it's not only that which matters. So that's not the ambition. But in times where not inside, I think it will be continue to work with the country that hosts the presidency as the number one answer, and to continue to be relevant. And Norway is interesting if we actually have views, insights, and competence that matters to the people who decide. If we just to be there is not the point in itself. It's only meaningful to be there if you have something to influence, which will be different because of our influence than from what otherwise would have happened. Because there's intelligent life outside of Norway, which means that a lot of good decisions can be made by people that even if we're not there, which we will normally agree with. But of course, if we have something to, that we would like to influence, I think we would. It's more cumbersome. It's like we influence the EU from the outside. We have quite a lot of experience on that. Yeah.
And main priorities this year, what have we or may we achieve? The summit is coming up soon.
So I think we have achieved, we, for instance, concretely, we joined this global alliance against power and poverty. Exactly, not power, poverty and hunger, which is a concrete delivery with sort of real material effects. That may be the most concrete thing, but of course we were deeply engaged in the discussions on global governance reform. I think we have contributed to the bridging of the different positions on tax. So there was a lot of hostility from some of the OECD countries against the whole idea of a universal convention. That has been lowered, and we can take some of the responsibility for that, not alone, of course. And I think also our very strong position on universal values are universal, and that the rule of law should apply to everybody has also been a constructive, in my view, input to show that not all Western countries are sticking to this double standard or are reflecting this critique on double standards.
Thank you. I'm sure there are questions also in the audience, so please raise your hand if you have one. Yeah, please. 2 seconds, you'll get a microphone.
Thank you for a wonderful speech. I never thought I would learn anything new about G20 or UN. I did. Thank you.
Wow.
You were mentioning this tax reform, this universal tax, and yes, it's true that OECD has done fantastic work on this. At the same time, in the G20, Brazil has brought out this thing against the billionaire tax.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little about that?
Our Minister of Finance has become very enthusiastic about the G20 because everybody was interested in our wealth taxation and our ground rent, or the tax on natural resources. That is a very intrinsic part in Norwegian taxation, and he came back very surprised about the level of interest now, because the world, the economic liberalization agenda is clearly over. There's actually almost no country left, maybe Milei in Argentina, but there hardly anybody left that believes in trickle-down economies or small state and so on. The big state is back, directional industrial policy is back everywhere. In most countries it was never out, but part of the West it was out. And that also means that there is a heightened understanding of the challenges of inequality, that inequality does not only create social problems, but also actually undermines growth, because growth is better with a more distributed income structure, rather than having a few very rich people and a lot of poor people, because the rich save and the poor have nothing to contribute. So we have a broader middle class is good. That understanding, which is of course intrinsic to a Nordic social democrat, is now much more in fashion, and we've seen that in the in G20 conversations. So billionaire tax fits into that, and the convention, that should be said. What we're working for globally is not. I said tax reform. That's actually not correct, because tax reform happens in a country. Taxation is national, and it's a deeply part of politics. It's actually one of the key things you discuss: who should pay how much, the high taxes, low taxes. This is actually the definition of left-right divisions in national politics. That will continue. What the convention is supposed to do is to strengthen the possibility of countries to actually tax by reducing the possibility of base erosion and profit shifting, which is which is a problem even here. And we are, probably among the countries that have the broadest tax base, which is why our taxes are not that high actually compared to some other European countries. But everybody pays tax, and somebody doesn't like tax, so they leave this for Switzerland. But the point is not to tell a country in, say, Africa how to tax, but to allow them to tax, to enable the possibility to make these choices before the money has left the country and ends up in Zurich or Cayman Islands.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Gustavo, the ambassador of Peru. So thank you, NUPI, for convening this meeting and also for these reports that I will be reading with a lot of interest. A small comment regarding representation that the lady mentioned. Now, though Brazil deserves a highest place in the international arena because of its population, economy, size, and everything else, Brazil doesn't really represent Latin America or doesn't really represent the Global South. I know that how we use Global South in different, easily we use Global South representation, and it's not necessarily the case. In order to get to representation, something else has to happen, so we could ask Brazil to represent us, and maybe that could happen some time and in some forms. So I think it's very interesting or important to bear this in mind. And a question for you, Minister Eide. Now that there's a strategy for Africa, for when the strategy for Latin America?
Thanks. Good. Two good questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I totally agree with you. What I've been trying to say is that Brazil tries to position itself as this leader in Latin America. And of course, Brazil has tried during the early 2000s to have more regionalization and to have other kinds of alternative corporations such as UNASUR. And also has tried to strengthen Mercosur and tried to position itself as a leader in the region. But I totally agree with you that it's about this claim of representation in the Global South, but it's a way in which to balance this idea of being the represent, but also representing the countries in Latin America. But thank you so much for your comment.
Well, this is actually a very important question because when let's say when the P5 was set up, it was not that anybody thought France would represent Europe. France represents France, and the UK represents the UK, and so on, right? So adding countries to that kind of bodies does not, it might better reflect the power distribution and the economic distribution in the world. But if your starting point is sovereign equality of states, it's not representation in that sense. And when the UN was formed, that was solved by combining, what I've written in my NUPI years is that it was actually a merge between a 19th century concert model and a 20th century representative model. So the 10 rotating would represent everybody, but by rotating, and the others were not supposed to be representative. They were more the guardians of the system. So that's specific for 45. So in a sense, just by adding more countries, you are doing something which was not exactly the intention back then. And how come around that? Well, one way would be, and it's actually easier if I use Africa than Latin America, is that you could imagine that there will be African seats, but they anchor their policies in the African Union if they want to. You could have an agreement in Africa, looking at the ambassador, where yes, there will be African seats, but they will have some kind of responsibility towards what for instance, have AU meetings before key decisions are made and so on. Easier in Africa than Latin America because you don't really have a Latin American Union of the same sort because there are competing models. But that could be a way around that. But it's really something that should be discussed with reform. How do you combine that with also real representation? So good question.
Yeah, I think
I recommend my own articles 30 years ago, which I think is on the archive, so because I was discussing that very issue. Yeah.
fantastic. No, I think it's one of the things that we brought up in the report, highlighting the tensions in the global south, or it's a difficult term. But maybe Cedric, you can pick up on that.
Yeah, I was actually going to make the same point that the ministers made, that I think if you compare with the African example, I think the addition of the African Union now as a permanent member of the G20 is a very interesting example of bringing the rest of the continent indirectly into the discussions. And of course, there's various preparatory steps that where the African Union needs to go through to prepare for the G20 meetings that involve then the broader African membership. In addition to, of course, South Africa potentially inviting, various African countries also as guests to the G20 meeting.
Hans-Jørgen?
Yeah, sure. I think you see on a global stage, especially China and India, work very hard to promote themselves as the representation of the broader global south. And definitely in a Chinese perspective, you will see that the more capital and richer and more developed it gets, it will work harder to retain that developing country like shared identity. And then of course it's the more countries develop and the larger seats and shares and voices that the largest countries take, obviously the more issues and dilemmas that it will represent towards the least developed and the poorest countries. But it's not, black and white. You can see that. I would definitely argue, if you look within quite a few organizations, also in the G20, that you see also quite active voicing for developing country interests. I think it's where it becomes more problematic when it comes to actual, the implementation or actual, making changes. You see that in climate change negotiations. You will see it around distribution of, the lending criteria in the financial infrastructure institution. You will see it around health and vaccination issues. So it's, I think it's also increasingly important that within these forums that the less developed and the least developed countries also are given more attention. And that's a shared responsibility for these countries themselves primarily, but obviously also other countries. But also in that capacity, I see potential in the BRICS developing, depending on how the bickering amongst the members themselves kind of turn out, because I definitely disagree also on quite a few issues. Adding more less developed countries to that group will give more voice and visibility. And at least from a Chinese perspective, it would love for the BRICS to really become a much more kind of dynamic a group, also directly delivering, messages within the G20.
Thanks. Any more questions? Yes, please.
With the Americans wavering on climate change,
could you introduce?
David Llewellyn, engineer living in Oslo. With Americans wavering on climate change, is there not an opportunity for the majority of G20 people to put some discrete pressure on Mr. Trump to say, hey, hang in there, this is good for the world as a whole? Norway could be a great example. It's just a thought to the minister.
Yeah.
Useful reflection. Yeah, please.
Let me say, so thank God we managed Dubai so well, because the last COP finally uttered the words transition away from fossil fuels, which is really the one big key to solving the climate crisis. That was I was deeply involved in that, and that was quite an achievement that we managed to get that. And of course, then there's a lot of caveats, but there's a direction. That overall direction is actually shared by most advanced economies until the 20th of January, also the United States, although it's a complex transition. I think that is happening. Too slow, of course, way too slow, but the direction is quite clear. what we will lose if, assuming that Trump does what he used to do and means what he says, which is a good start, they will probably leave the Paris Accord. What will that mean? Well, that will mean that we will have less forceful American presence in driving the agenda. But America will continue to transition because that's happening at state level. I think we in this country, who's a very centralized country, we sometimes we forget that the U.S. is a very federal system where most economic decisions are made at state level or in private business, of course, and American businesses and all the states with people in them. There are 50 states, but there are 15, 20 that are actually populated. The rest is a big void in the middle, and they are all on board. And then the last time. They formed alliances like we're still in, where you had major cities and major states saying we will continue to act as if we were in, and the Texans have now learned, not because of ideology but because of economy, that enlarging the share of renewables is makes sense money-wise. So I'm not so worried about the U.S. stopping to transition. But we will probably have, we will definitely have less leadership than that of John Kerry and now John Podesta in the international forest.
Thanks. We have only 2 minutes left, so maybe there's a burning question or a comment, but if not, I think we will start to land. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Rodrigo, Ambassador of Brazil. Just would like to thank Norway participation in the G20. The feedback that we received was really engaging in all the working groups, and the meetings was really excellent. And we are looking for, of course, to the follow-up of the meetings. And I believe I've been here just for 2 months, so it's good timing to be here. I'm very lucky to have this opportunity to follow up on what you have been discussing in G20, of course, and the other bilateral meetings. And for my colleague from Peru, I have to remember you that Mexico and Argentina are part of G20 as well. And of course, we do have a coordination in South America and in Latin America. And of course, all the contributions are very, very welcome. But thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. So then I would like to thank everyone for attending today, both here in the room and online, and for the panel and for the minister to come and share his thoughts. And I would like to wish you good luck with the summit coming up in 10 days.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.